I'm going to start. We have people entering the waiting room, but you've all joined us sort of early. We have debates about how early in the morning it is. So we want to get started so we have plenty of time to talk. I am going to just say a couple things. My name is Hilary Botein. I'm the interim associate dean here at the Marxe School, and I'm also the interim director of the Howard J. Samuels State and City Policy Center. And we're really pleased to have you here. The Marxe School hasn't done one of these morning events for a long time, and we're excited about it, and we're very excited about the content. And other people are going to introduce our speakers. I just wanted to say, for those of you who are doctoral students, the Samuels Center is now funding dissertation writing that's focused on state and city policy issues, and we really hope many of you will apply for that funding. It's kind of a unique niche of funding. And our inaugural fellow for the Samuel Center is Christina Greer, who's going to be talking to you later on. So there's lots going on in the Samuel Center. We hope you'll follow the work that we do. And I'm going to turn it over, speaking of the Samuel Center, to Morgan Pehme, who's on the advisory board of the Samuel Center, has been really instrumental in helping us craft this inaugural event.
Thank you so much, Hilary. I'm pleased to bring everybody to this first event of the Howard J. Samuels State and City Policy Center here at the Marxe School. It is my great honor to serve on the advisory committee of the Samuels Center. It is named after Howard Samuels, who is perhaps best known by New Yorkers as the Democratic Party's 1966 nominee for lieutenant governor, and his campaigns for governor, particularly in 1974, when he was narrowly defeated in the primary by Hugh Carey. But above all, Samuels was a policy wonk. He was devoted to innovating and improving government. As the journalist Ken Oletta said, Samuels was much more of a visionary than a politician. Among his greatest contributions to New York was his advocacy for the 1967 State Constitutional Convention. And on the national level, as Undersecretary of Commerce and the Director of the Small Business Administration under President Lyndon Johnson, he spearheaded a program called Section 8, which was geared at bringing compensatory capitalism to Black-owned businesses, which was really the first institutionalized attempt by the federal government at something that resembles reparations to the Black community. Samuels passed away in 1984. He was subsequently honored by the New York State Legislature with the endowment of this center in his name. Howard's son, Bill Samuels, has picked up his father's mantle as a warrior for good government. Among Bill's many accomplishments was leading the campaign to rid the state legislature of then State Senator Pedro Espada, who some of you may remember threw New York State into chaos, along with his self-dubbed Four Amigos. Bill Samuels also recently, among Bill's recent accomplishments, was his co-founding of 21 in 21, which was aimed at bringing gender parity to the New York City Council in 2021. That not only succeeded, but now there are a majority of women in the New York City Council for the first time in history. And he also spearheaded the effort, the unsuccessful effort to hold a constitutional convention in 2017. But among the amendments that Bill had proposed along with the constitutional convention have been really forward-thinking constitutional changes, such as the Environmental Rights Act, which we voters approved in 2021, giving New Yorkers the right to clean water and clean air for the first time. And now, in 2023, the state legislature passed the Equal Rights Amendment, which will, for the first time, put women and the LGBT community into the state constitution, acknowledging that all New Yorkers indeed are equal. His daughter, Kitty Samuels, continues the family work as a journalist and a documentarian. And it's really my great privilege to serve alongside the Samuelses on the Samuels Center. The Samuels Center is really geared at promoting state and city innovation. And that is why we have this program where we give money to support policy work by visionaries of the future. Particularly, we are now gearing the money that we give to studies, to promote studies, to graduate students who are oftentimes the people who are most in need of resources to support their work. So we urge you to apply for the Samuels grant money. And also we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Christina Greer as the very first Samuels Fellow, and we will be awarding Samuels Fellowships annually from here on out. So please follow the work of the Samuels Center. We're so grateful to Dr. Greer, to Doug Muzzio, and to the Marxe School for supporting this inaugural event of the Samuels Center.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Morgan, and thank you, Hilary. We are so honored at the Marxe School to host the Samuels Center, so we very much appreciate that. And I'm so impressed. We have almost 70 people in attendance this morning. I know you're all very excited to listen to this dynamic duo that we have here, Christina Greer and Doug Muzzio. I'm just certain the conversation is going to be very interesting. Thank you for joining us here this morning. It's my great pleasure to introduce them to you. Christina Greer is an associate professor of political science at Fordham University Lincoln Center. Her research and teaching focus on American politics, Black ethnic politics, campaigns and elections, and public opinion. She's currently working on a book manuscript about the political contributions of Barbara Jordan, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Stacey Abrams. She's a frequent political commentator on several media outlets, including the New York-centered podcast FAQ NYC, and the host of The Blackest Questions with Greer. Thank you, Christina, for being here with us this morning. And our very own Doug Muzzio, who is recently retired professor from the Marxe School, where he taught for more than 40 years. Thank you for that service, Doug. He specializes in American public opinion, voting behavior, and city politics. He has extensive political, governmental, and media experience, and is the political analyst and on-air commentator for WABC TV in New York City, and has done polling and political analysis for ABC TV and other news organizations for more than 2 decades. Thank you both for being here. We're looking forward to this, and I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Dean Ryan. I just want to thank everyone for joining us. We were debating before you all got online whether or not 8:30 was a late start to the day or an early start to the day. So it's really encouraging to see so many people logged on. When Doug and I were thinking about this conversation, we landed on From Dinkins to Adams and the Future of New York City Politics, because as some of you who may follow New York City politics know, Doug and I have been in conversation in print pages for many, many years. Oftentimes we're quoted side by side, either saying similar or maybe sometimes different things. But I wanted to give a context in the conversation. So before we get started, I just want to have some thank yous. I want to thank Dean Ryan. I want to thank my dear friend Morgan Pehme, who even introduced me to the great faculty and staff at Baruch, and obviously Hilary and Sherry for putting all of this together. We know that those are the real people who make these things possible. I want to thank my students for tuning in. I see quite a few of them here, and obviously I have to shout out Janet Bell, and I see John Mollenkoff, who are just great friends and supporters. And so I want to thank everyone for joining us. So I'm really excited. You know, Doug has been such an influential force, not just in my work and scholarship, but for those of us who love New York City. And, you know, I was talking to my Tufts advisor. I went to Tufts undergrad. We had dinner last night when he was in town. And I was trying to explain why it is people would live in this city of 9 million people, sometimes in a 600 square foot apartment in a 5th floor walk up, making not the same wages as one can make in a city, you know, like St. Louis or even Baltimore. So there's something about this city that grabs a hold of us and doesn't let go. And so with Doug, I wanted to talk about the leadership that we've seen in the city in the past, the present, and then get his analysis on the future. I know Doug thinks he's retiring, but we've got our claws in him. And so we need his brain because Eric Adams doesn't make sense to a lot of people if you don't fully understand where we've come as a city. And so, Doug, I want to start with this question about the context in which David Dinkins was elected, the first Black mayor of New York City, because we had Tom Bradley, and if we think about the three largest cities in the United States, we had Tom Bradley elected in Los Angeles in 1973. We had Harold Washington, the late great Harold Washington, I could talk about him all day, elected in the city of Chicago in 1983, and then we have David Dinkins in 1989. And so this was the first time where now all three major cities in the United States are checked off. But up until recently, Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York had been one and done cities in the sense that they had one Black mayor and that was it. Now we see Los Angeles has Karen Bass, Chicago had Lori Lightfoot, and now we'll have Brandon Johnson. New York had Eric Adams, but unlike cities like Philadelphia and Atlanta and Washington, D.C., once they got their first Black mayor, they had several Black mayors afterwards. So there was something about New York that was a little bit different. So I wanted to ask you about the context of New York, because some of my research talks about New York is the canary in the mine in many ways for Black politics. Oftentimes we think about Chicago because Harold Washington in 1983 helps Jesse Jackson in 1984 and 1988. Obviously, Barack Obama comes from the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois. And so Chicago has a very strong Black political lineage, but so does New York in a lot of ways. And so I wanted you to sort of lay out some of, I was around, but I wasn't in politics then. I was a teeny bit younger. Some of the context that David Dinkins gets elected in 1989, sort of post-Koch, pre-Giuliani, who we'll talk about in a moment.
Okay. Let's begin with 1988. 1988, in the Democratic presidential primary, Jackson won New York City. He energized the Black elected leadership, the Black participatory leadership, and the Black population. So you had this upsurge of interest in a Black leader, and was just influential in electing, quote unquote, the preeminent Black national leader. So in April of '89, I became Dave Dinkins' chief policymaker and issues director. And we were in a dogfight with Ed Koch, who was entering possibly his fourth term, had served 3, had just gone through a series of scandals, but he was a formidable candidate. And it was a tight race all the way through. And then we had several racial incidents. We had the killing of Joseph Hawkins, and it was a bitter race because we had an intense dislike of Koch. It was seen as a continuation, and it was of 9 years and of Koch. And frankly, we were sick of Koch, and we were sick of the fact that we didn't have a Black mayor, and we didn't have a candidate who appealed to a larger segment of the population. And Dinkins was the consummate gentleman, civil, respectful, and he had the gorgeous mosaic. He had a mantra, and it was a meaningful mantra that the people of the city could come together and form. Even though we were isolated pieces of glass, when you put us together, we were this gorgeous mosaic. But at the same time, it is a time of intense racial heat. The racial temperature was high. Spike Lee does Do the Right Thing, and it was almost an archetype of the feeling at the time. And Dinkins was seen as a healer and won a very close primary and then an extremely close general election against Republican Rudolph Giuliani, the former
U.S. attorney.
Yes, thank you, Morgan. for the Southern District. And that was a bitter campaign. And we won narrowly 50,000 votes out of almost 2 million cast, the largest turnout of an election since 1989. And we prevailed.
So I want to back up just a little bit because, I've written about the legacy of the Jackson campaigns, the Jesse Jackson presidential campaigns of 84, but especially 88, and how that has influenced Black leaders in cities. And so I know that Dinkins was Jackson's New York finance chair. After Jackson runs in 84 and 88, we get Wilson Goode, the first Black mayor of Philadelphia. We get the first Black mayors of a lot of major cities. Kurt Schmoke's elected. We had appointed mayors, but now we start seeing elected mayors because of that presidential election. Can you tell us a little bit more about Dinkins' professional career? We know that he was a Manhattan borough president.
Right.
He's part of the Gang of Four with
Right.
with Charlie Rangel being the last member of the Four. So we had Basil Patterson, the father of David Patterson. I'm saying this history for my students who, may not know the long lineage of New York leadership. Basil Patterson, the first in the Gang of Four, his son, David Patterson, is lieutenant governor, then becomes appointed governor. We've got Percy Sutton, who's, the long legacy of the Sutton family and the Apollo, and he was Manhattan borough president as well. We had David Dinkins, who becomes the first Black mayor, and then Charlie Rangel, the Lion of Congress, who was in the House of Representatives representing Harlem for 46 years. That's 23 campaigns that he won and 4 redistrictings. So walk us through a little bit more about David Dinkins' professional career that leads us to him becoming the first Black mayor.
Well, again, it's centered in Harlem. It was the center of the New York Black political universe. There was essentially no other Black core of leadership. And he started in the legislature, moved to borough president, and then mayor. Now, similarly to Adams, he started in the legislature, became borough president, and then became mayor. So they took a traditional route to the office. They worked in steps. They took one step and another and another. So there's similarities there. And unlike other mayors in between, they followed a traditional political path. And then you have this going ahead to Adams, you have the geographical shift is profound. It shifts to Brooklyn. And you articulated all the Brooklyn Pols who are the center of the leadership. And in fact, the Harlem Gang of Four has died literally. And the political leadership was not handed down really to the sons. So there's a short break somewhere in the 90s, and in a sense, Dinkins is the acme of Harlem political power.
So before we jump to Adams and Brooklyn and the new power base that's slightly south of Harlem, let's talk a little bit more about your time in the Dinkins administration. So you all get elected. I've heard stories from Phil Thompson, who wrote a book about Dinkins, and he's like, listen, we had a plan for ending apartheid, but that was about it. He was like, we were really shocked that we won. And all of a sudden we've got to help run the largest, greatest city in the United States. So tell us, about the early days after election, and then what you did in your capacity working with the former mayor.
Well, in fact, after the election, I stayed on for a couple of months making the transition plans for the mayor in a broad variety of issue areas. And then I returned to my full-time job at Baruch. So the influence is and in the initial formulation of the policy. I mean, we had the policy book, the huge binders that lay out the policy directions that we were proposing during the campaign. And as I understand from the governmental end, it was a very disturbing, unsettled time because, you know, as Robert Redford said after he won the Senate election, what do we do now? And there was that kind of uncertainty because of the uniqueness of the mayor and the uniqueness of the situation.
Mhm. So, you know, I think about Dinkins and, you know, everyone always says, and I spent some time with him before he passed, you know, he was a conciliatory man, you know, he was very charming. And the pendulum swung from Dinkins to Giuliani, which doesn't surprise me, doesn't surprise many scholars of Black politics. The pendulum swings from Barack Obama to someone like Donald Trump. Again, not surprising. We've seen this in cities time and time again. You sort of get your first Black elected, and then the person who comes after them, I mean, listen, you can even say the Dailies after Harold Washington, it's someone who is racially incendiary, if I'm being polite, at 8:55 in the morning, and kind of the antithesis of the Black leadership that we saw first get elected. So really, I don't want to spend much time on Rudy Giuliani. I've got better things to do in my life. But let's quickly just kind of go from Dinkins to Giuliani to Bloomberg, who makes me chuckle, right? It's like the subways are going up. He's like, then ride a bike. But where do we go from Dinkins to 2 terms of Giuliani, right? We know that Dinkins beats Giuliani by 50,000 points the first time and loses to Giuliani by 50,000 points the second time, right? In between that, when Dinkins was mayor, you know, Giuliani leads the riot on City Hall with police officers and firefighters and calling him a shoe shine boy and the N-word and all the things, right, that are not surprising to me or anyone else when we see what happened to Giuliani in the 21st century. He was always that person. But we go from 2 terms of Giuliani, 3 terms of Bloomberg, and then 2 terms of de Blasio. I guess we could call it that. I mean, he kind of checked out after the first 2 years, but he still gets reelected. So we've got this like 20-year gap of a very diverse white leadership, 3 individuals that represent, you know, New York in very different ways. I mean, Bloomberg, we know, changed his party affiliation because he just didn't feel like going through the primary process, but still caucused with George W. Bush as president. So he was a Republican, even though he sort of was like, I'm an independent. And he gets elected by saying, you know, listen, I'm beholden to no one. And then, you know, obviously during much of his tenure, he's like, yeah, I'm beholden to no one. It's like, oh, the intonation does matter. So walk us through sort of really briefly those 3 terms that are in between Dinkins and before we get to Adams in the moment that we're currently in.
Okay, I mean, first of all, the obvious thing is that they are all white. And as you said, the first one of those, Rudy Giuliani, was the antithesis of Dinkins, both in personality and in politics. Now, the reason why, or one of the reasons why Dinkins lost is, first of all, the 1990 recession, which was predictable. I was in the room with Dave and the Municipal Priorities Group, and the head of it said, why are you running? Look at the trend lines. The economy's going down the toilet. And Dave said, we'll deal with it. So the economy went into recession. Then you have racial conflict. You have Crown Heights, and then you have the Korean deli boycott, Red Apple. And that moved the public perception away from Dinkins as conciliated, but he was a conciliator during the boycott. He made many public statements saying that racial boycotting was anathema to him and should have been anathema to the city. But he was tarred by that. And he was tarred as being a weak mayor because of the violence and the antipathy between primarily Black groups and Jews and Koreans or Asians. So he ran into a buzzsaw. But again, as you point out, Christina, he lost by 50,000 votes the second time. And looking at the polling data, it looks like the reason why he lost is a lot of Black voters stayed home thinking that David Dinkins would win, and Rudy Giuliani squeaks by. And Rudy Giuliani is a tough guy. He was a tough guy on the machine in the Bronx and in Queens. He's a tough guy versus the mafia. I remember he drove down the streets of Little Italy in his car and just dared the thugs to do something about it. So there was a New York City street toughness about him. And we know that he was a divisive mayor. And he used divisiveness as a political tool. And it reached its peak with the Abner Diallo situation, where he was strongly in favor of the actions of not the killing, but the reactions of the police, law and order. That was Giuliani's mantra, law and order. And that incident was a really critical turning point in Giuliani's relationship. It just got infinitely worse because he was blamed, not necessarily legitimately, but he was blamed for the atmosphere in the city. And that led to the election of 2001 and Mike Bloomberg. Now, Mike Bloomberg on September 10th had no chance to winning the mayoral nomination. Mm-hmm. His resume just didn't fit the times. And on the next day, his resume became extremely valuable to him. And then the $90+ million he spent on the campaign and the bond. Excuse me?
I said on the books. There's the on the books spending and the off the books
spending.
Oh,
yeah. Well, I mean, we're not counting street money. So, forget about that. And he bought the Independence Party, lock, stock, and barrel. And he bought, or he had given to him the major media, the Post, the news, and he came in with an anxious city, a very anxious city, and a city which felt unsteady. Where were we going? Where were we headed? I just remember the Armory on 25th Street was supposed to be the headquarters of the medical evacuation of the 9/11, and there was nobody, and there were street signs. So, and you went downtown, and the streets were ripped up. The smell lasted for months. So, we were on rocky grounds, and Bloomberg sort of gave us some stability and some hope that he could bring us through, that the financial wherewithal, the relationship with the economic actors, the rope that they gave him by raising the property tax, all of that led to, I think, a first-term success by the mayor in terms of the psychology of the city.
And Doug, hold on, I'm going to pause there and just add a little context for some of the students who have tuned in, because this is during, the fall of when 9/11 happens. And so many of my students weren't born during 9/11, just to give some sort of context as to, I always ask my students, like, where were you during 9/11? Where were you doing, Barack Obama's, inauguration? And each year, I, of course, stay young and fresh, but my students are just like, we weren't born yet. So this is a really important time, because not only were New Yorkers scared as far as safety, people not wanting to ride the subway, there's some some health concerns, but the economic viability of the city, as Doug laid out, was in real question. There were some major corporations that were thinking about moving just across the bridge to New Jersey. Bloomberg definitely had a lot of walk around money. He's a billionaire, not because he made widgets, he's a media billionaire. And so that obviously helps with the context in which he's elected. There are many Black clergy members who were silent. So, we have to ask ourselves, why is that? Why were you not really weighing in? And that goes to see previous comment about walk around money.
Right.
And then we have to remember the Democratic primary that was very crowded.
Oh,
But we had a runoff, don't forget, and we've had decreased political participation in our municipal elections every single term, percentage-wise. It's been pretty abysmal and embarrassing. But we have to remember during the runoff between Freddie Ferrer and Mark Green, right? And there were some ads where Freddie Ferrer's face was darkened when he was, and pictures of him next to Al Sharpton. And so when Mark Green is victorious as the Democratic nominee, there are many Black and Latino New Yorkers who weren't terribly excited about his candidacy. So that also helps with the Bloomberg win in 2001.
yeah, Mark Green, it was the perfect storm. Mark Green was a victim of a perfect storm, and part of the perfect storm was his own cause. I remember getting on the bus on 9/11. It was a Tuesday. It was primary day. And the first votes seemed to show that Freddie Ferrer was going to win. Very, very preliminary. And the race was called off. And Green and Ferrer were stuck in a blood match. And Green committed some real faux pas, particularly with the Hispanic community, and particularly in the Bronx, which effectively defeated him. And he lost by 4 points. There was a lot of self-destruction involved and bad blood between the Hispanic community and much of the Democratic Party and Green.
So let's fast forward. So we've got this Boston mayor who gives himself, and everyone's like, he stole a third term. It's like, no, we voted for it. And then we voted for him. So he did not steal a third term, right? And then, he has Christine Quinn essentially help him facilitate said third term.
He did steal a third term.
She could be mayor. And then that didn't work out for her in 2013. We've got a crowded primary again.
Right.
And we get another Boston mayor, Bill de Blasio,
Right.
Who comes in on stop and frisk. We've got the famous Dante ad with his Black son, right? He's saying this is a problem. We've got Bill Thompson, who's a little mealy-mouthed on stop and frisk. We've got Anthony Weiner, who's got scandal on scandal, right? We've got Christine Quinn, who's being punished for the sins of Bloomberg. And then we've got John Liu, who just can't get any traction. And essentially what he says, de Blasio says, and the tall white guy sort of gets in 40.1%.
And also Lou is challenged by legal problems, which he did,
24-year-old,
which he didn't have.
Right. Oh, Steve Romlowski's in the chat. Hi, Steve Romlowski, my favorite data scientist in all of New York City. So we have this a very crowded Democratic primary. De Blasio is victorious. Largely, the conversation of stop and frisk, he's polling dead last fourth or fifth in July. And by the time we vote, he not only wins, but he avoids a runoff, which is, sort of shocking. So we have these 8 years of de Blasio, who's this progressive mayor, from the section of Brooklyn where all the journalists live. And, it's basically, and this is important because it's kind of like he gets the Upper West Side and these like 5 little neighborhoods in Brooklyn. Fast forward, Eric Adams doesn't even campaign in those areas because it's like, You guys aren't for me. So walk us through briefly this 8, and we say 8 years of de Blasio, but I feel like we had de Blasio for 2 years, and then we started looking at Iowa and New Hampshire and anywhere not New York. I mean, this man was utterly bored with us.
Right.
So walk us through really quickly these 2 terms of de Blasio. And also, Doug, why do you think de Blasio didn't have a significant challenger for his reelection? We have Steve Albanese, but I'm going to say that's not a significant challenger in my book, right? Why didn't someone step up? Why didn't someone like Ruben Diaz Jr. or someone else say, you know what, like this guy doesn't even seem like he likes being here. Let's just, we've got universal pre-K, but like other than that, what are your greatest hits? I mean, crime is low, sure, but like, why didn't we see another Democrat try and step up? Because we see it with women all the time. It doesn't matter how well they're doing, they always have a challenger. So why didn't de Blasio have one?
Well, I agree that de Blasio's 2 terms was really first 2 years. He came in, he was a progressive candidate. He had progressive ideas, you know, pre-K, all the policy items that he advocated were really popular, particularly stop and frisk. So, but then, unfortunately, he was a legend in his own mind. He thought he was the avatar of an emerging national progressive movement. And in 2016, he refused to back Hillary Clinton, for whom he was a previous campaign manager, and wanted to hold a conference of progressive leaders in Iowa. And the dream collapsed there. And he worked as a lowly volunteer for Hilary in Iowa. So I think de Blasio was defeated by himself. And he did not have the foresight to articulate and carry through the agenda. That was his lack of leadership. He didn't have the strategy, the tactics, and the operations and the personnel to carry forward the progressive agenda that he had articulated. And so the last 6 years are a series of mistakes, scandals, etc. So it was unfortunate because there were high hopes for him as a candidate, but in the first year or two as a mayor, but after that it was dead time.
I'm in Brooklyn. I had you muted because I had some sirens. Why do you think he gets reelected so easily?
Well, I think it's the fear of the incumbent mayor. You don't run against the mayor in his second term when you had 2-term limits, and then you can keep your powder dry for the next election. So there's that natural hesitancy. In 1997, there were, the same thing with Ruth Messenger. She was not the strongest Democratic possible candidate, but she was the one who was willing to go against the obvious winner in 1997. So there's a reluctance to challenge a mayor in his second term of a 2-term limit.
Okay, so then let's fast forward to 2021. Again, crowded primary, right? And I love the political process. We've got, strong women in the race, but we also have a new system, which is ranked choice voting, something that, we had never had in the previous sort of modern day elections. We have, not just one, but 2 Black candidates, right? 3, excuse me. We've got Ray McGuire, the millionaire. We've got Maya Wiley, sort of the Politico, MSNBC, but not necessarily a hardcore New Yorker in many people's imaginations. Right. And then you've got Eric Adams, who, isn't a lawyer. He's very blue collar and he leans into that. He's a former cop. He really leans into that. Right. I would say, and I tell people this all the time, there are 9 million of us here. I would probably put us, Doug, honestly, in like the top 1% of people who know this city. I probably put a lot of people on this call in the top 1%. Morgan, yes, with us, right? I'd put Eric Adams in the top 10 people who know this city, who understand the nuances of Blackness in the city, who understand white people in this city and their capacity for integration and sort of progressive politics. I think that there are many shades of blue in this city that Eric Adams understands. So part of him not going to the Upper West Side or the 5 neighborhoods in Brooklyn where Catherine Garcia, who's not Latina, by the way, her last name is, but she is not. She and Maya Wiley and why am I blanking on his name? Sean Donovan, right? They sort of lived at Scott Stringer. They like lived in these areas and sort of campaigned in these areas. And Eric Adams is like, you guys aren't going to vote for me. Like, we already get it. So let me go to these outer boroughs who haven't heard from anyone, who haven't seen these candidates ever, and talk to these folks, because I know how to talk to these folks because I'm not new to this, right? Ray McGuire, everything was Technicolor for Ray McGuire. He's like, did you know that there's like inequities in education? Yes, Ray, we all know this. Like, we get it. So you're a millionaire. Thank you for joining the party. You're a touch late. So, and then we have, who else do we have? We've got Diane Morales, who has Mutiny on the Bounty with her own people, right? And so she's out. Scott Stringer de facto becomes the progressive candidate. He gets out. And then Maya Wiley de facto becomes that progressive candidate as well. So we have all these things moving around in 2021. And so Eric Adams is able to lean into, you know, the prospect of, you know, being a Black mayor, but give us some context and nuance about some of the similarities and differences between Adams and Dinkins, and even the moment that we're in between an Adams and a Dinkins, because for a lot of, say, the Black elite, they're just like, this man is no David Dinkins. It's like, correct, like, and he's fine with that. But there are a lot of homeowners in Brooklyn and Queens who would say, not only do we do want police, right? Because we're tired of riffraff and shenanigans. We don't want to be over policed. We don't want our sons to be stopped and frisked, but we actually are not into sort of like take away police, because so many Black people use the police as an entree into the middle class. They are police officers as an, it's a union job, right? Either you're a civilian or you're an armed or you're a uniformed officer. So the idea of policing, and, you know, we've seen this with Black families over decades, you know, using military service or government jobs or union jobs, of which the police department is one, as an entree into the middle class. So there's a real nuance of Black politics that I think Eric Adams understood and understands in a way that white Democratic New Yorkers were like, he's terrible, no one would like him. And I was like, white ethnics love him. A lot of Black people love him too, right? Even though he seems to me to run across the political spectrum in a lot of ways, because he can be very progressive, let's just say when it comes to LGBTQ plus issues or whatever it may be. And then also it's like, he sounds like Cuomo and Trump. I don't know what it is about Queens, but these boys all sound identical to me. So where are we with this kind of comparison of the two?
Well, I mean, Dinkins was really a classic liberal up and down the line. And as you point out, there's nothing typical about Adams. Adams, his electoral strategy was, as you say, Blacks, Hispanics, out of borough, whites, lower income, lower education voters. And that was the constituency he went after. And additionally, it wasn't issues so much with Adams. It was that Adams had personality. The previous mayor had no personality. The previous mayor to him had no personality. The previous mayor to him had a personality, but it was a negative personality. So he came across as not only with different ideas and different orientations, unexpected, he came in with, you know, a night mayor type of aura, that he was a new type of mayor. He was an outside mayor. He was the people's mayor. And that was, I think, really instrumental in breaking away from the classic recipe for a Democratic candidate winning.
Yeah.
And also, his opposition was weak. There were no outstanding candidates. There were no candidates with a real citywide reputation. And that was a great advantage. And in the new voting system, obviously, I still don't know. I know how it works, but
right. So
let me just shrug my shoulders.
Right. Well, we'll have to have a follow-up conversation and bring in Steve Romlowski so he can walk us through it again. I'm like, Steve, walk me through this one more time. Okay, because the thing is with Adams, there are a few things that I find interesting, because in that race, and this is, I guess, what's frustrating for me about New York City politics, there seems to be a lot of quantity, but not necessarily quality. In a city of 9 million people, I thought that the quality of candidates, of people who fully understood New York and the issues, would be greater. It seemed like a lot of people who had good intentions, but I was just like, do you fully understand this city, right? I mean, do you understand the connection between the mayor and Albany, and him going to Albany with his tin can, and the relationship between the mayor and the governor? And there were a lot of gaps, I thought, for a lot of the candidates there. But here's another thing, Doug, that I thought was fascinating. I have this FAQ NYC podcast with Harry Siegel and now Katie Honan. And I talked to a lot of journalists just on the side. Obviously, many of them are white, many of them are my age or younger. So they weren't in the city even during, say, like the Koch, Dinkins, even Giuliani years. So there's like a gap in knowledge, and many of them weren't even in the city during the Bloomberg years. So whenever I would talk to them, and Eric Adams is a peculiar personality. That's me being polite at 9:20. And they would always say, oh, he's obsessed with rats. And I was like, here's the thing that you all don't get. First of all, there's kind of this apoplectic attitude amongst sort of the white donor class, because they don't know Eric Adams, and they don't know anybody who does know Eric Adams. And they also don't know the type of Black person that Eric Adams is. They know a certain Black person, but they don't know him. So they're sort of like, he's new, he's foreign. But this was the thing with rats. All these journalists would always make these jokes about, like, Eric Adams is obsessed with rats. And I was like, but you all have never talked to anyone who's lived with rats. You've never interviewed sort of people. It's like, I'm blessed enough, I've never lived with rats. However, I have talked to a lot of people who said, for years, I have not been able to sleep, I haven't been able to eat, I haven't been able to keep food in my house, I'm worried about my children constantly because we have rats. And we've called every single politician, we've begged, we've pleaded, we've cried, and no one has cared. And then Eric Adams comes and he's drowning rats on the steps of City Hall. And so, everyone's like, yeah, he comes and he's drowning these rats. And it's like, right. But those are voters who understood this man actually heard my cry, literally heard my cry. So when I'm talking to certain people who said, well, for years, everyone's just like, whatever, you're poor, you live with rats, and that's just the way it is. I mean, what? The Bronx is the only borough that's actually attached to mainland America, right? So it's like, we're surrounded by water consistently, and he took them seriously. And so I think about, when we say outer borough, or, low income, or, low educated voters, it's like, but there's still New Yorkers that have issues. There's a different type of issues, but like at the end of the day, most New Yorkers want clean streets, safe schools, safe neighborhoods. I mean, it's not like, poor New Yorkers want anything different from rich New Yorkers. So I just felt like he tapped into something that so many politicians writ large didn't fully understand, in like this crisis. And I felt like he was mocked for it to a certain extent, which I was like, and this is how he sort of stays winning, and people scratch their heads. Like, how is this guy sort of ascending to become the 110th mayor of New York City? I mean, this isn't, Topeka, no offense, but like, it's New York City. And I'm just like, there's a certain attention to detail, which I think is hilarious, because people aren't getting their food stamps, and, he's dropped the ball on several issues as mayor, but like, there's a certain level of detail that he has when it comes to particular populations in the city.
Yeah, but he's got problems. He's a micromanager.
Mm-hmm.
He's hired inferior personnel in important issues. He appears to be disjointed in his views. They are not there's no coherence.
Mm-hmm.
It seems that he jumps from rats to crime to education, and he never quite grapples with the issues. Now, rats may be the best example, but there's a feeling out there that he's not quite major league yet.
Mm-hmm.
He's got a major league personality. He's a major league New Yorker, but in terms of the administration and in terms of policy, I don't think he's quite there. I don't know if he's got the command of the city, as you talked about, the intergovernmental relations, even though he served in both the state house and in the city.
But that was a million years ago, the state house, right?
I see him as an open book in many ways. And he's got real positives, but he's got real negatives too.
Right.
And
So-
I don't know what the next election looks like.
Well, that was my question for you, because we're only in 2023, but we know 2025 is basically tomorrow, right? I mean, like time
Right.
flies. So obviously, I want to sort of get your analysis on a few issues. So one, there's obviously the looming conversation about crime, because Black mayors are always judged on crime in a way that like no one else is assessed in the same exact way, right? So we got to get crime, sort of that conversation on the table. But
Right.
as you said, it seems as though, I mean, you know, the nighttime mayor and nightlife, and I'm just like, okay, sir, you know, at a certain point in time, being outside can get you in trouble. So like, be inside. That's just my old school personal opinion. But it does seem like he's kind of like a hummingbird, right? He's all over the place, everywhere and kind of nowhere at once, right? So what is the real policy? But is it one of those things, Doug? And I don't know. I mean, you know, where he's kind of touch pointing. I do agree that there's some staffing preguntas I have and some real problems I have with, say, I don't know, for example, Phil Banks, right? Commissioner Banks. That's my biggest issue. Like already off the jump, I was just like, you lost me. So I feel like, you know, he's very loyal to people who I find problematic.
Yeah.
But it's almost though we still have 2 years. And I'm curious because let's just say, for example, when I write, I don't write in a linear fashion. And when I quilt, I don't quilt in the same fashion. I'm all over the place. And then hopefully at the end, a product emerges and it's cohesive and it's consistent and there's a story to it. Are we seeing something where this man, you know, he hires Diane Savino to handle Albany because it's like, I haven't been there in forever. So like she knows it and she knows Republicans and she knows Democrats. Is it, even though I'm hiring my shady bestie who, you know, is highly problematic to say the very least, but he's still trying to hire maybe some former Bloombergites and some other people who actually do have skill sets. And maybe because he's in the nightlife, he's not going to micromanage them as much. Like, where would you, I know people don't like to give people grades, but whatever, we're professors. Where would you grade him right now? Because we're well past the 1 year mark. He's tussling with, you know, Democratic President Biden. He's not like de Blasio with Cuomo and that, you know, fragile ego match that we were caught in the middle of as New Yorkers. I think Eric Adams does understand that Kathy Hochul has the power of the purse, even though she's, in my estimation, most likely a one-term governor, right? And the reason why we don't have control of the House. But, you know, but he hasn't flexed on her, and there's some racial and gender dynamics to that as well. So like, where would you put him right now? And then I want to get your analysis on like literally issue by issue.
C plus B minus.
Okay.
There's hope. There's some performance, but there's big question marks, and you know, maybe an incomplete. But if I were going to give a grade, it'd be C plus B minus.
Okay. So in the chat, we've got some questions. We've got lots of questions about housing, right? And so, you know, and then another question about real estate developers. Listen, New York City is nothing but real estate. I mean, I think that's why Eric Adams is like, take off your pajamas and get to work, right? I mean, we know, like, you know, I'm not going to speak about Baruch and CUNY, but I will speak about Columbia and NYU and Fordham, right? These are real estate agencies that teach kids on the side. Like, we can't have a conversation about New York without having a conversation about real estate. So real estate and housing. We know that there are many ways that de Blasio kind of dropped the ball and kind of left Adams holding the bag. We know that we have an influx of immigrants. We are a city/nation of immigrants. So we will always have an influx of immigrants. So like, let's not clutch our pearls. Like, new people to New York is what New York is. So where are we with housing? What has Adams done? And what should he be doing to sort of help solve this crisis that no one seemed to be able to solve? And also, backdrop, We're still in the midst of a global pandemic called COVID.
You're asking me
Yes, Doug,
for
solve the
housing
problems of New York
policy
at
that
9:30 in the
works
morning, please.
and nobody else can do? I mean, really, it seems intractable. I hate to say it, but where are you going to build new housing? I mean, we have, 90 people in the audience. They must have, a sense of what we can do with housing other than building public housing, which in fact has been, starved for cash for decades. Where do we build the housing now? The traditional formula has been, build luxury housing, have set asides for affordable housing, and that's how we do it. I don't see that as the answer, but I have no answer. None. Zero.
Okay. I mean, that's fair. I don't, I won't charge you with solving New York's problems all on your own. Now, here is the question, though. I do want to go back to crime and Black mayors, because we know that oftentimes cities have gotten their first Black mayor when there has been white flight, middle class flight,
Yep.
and, cities are under capacity, the tax base is under capacity, and then it's like, oh, we're on a financial cliff. Let's elect our first Black mayor, right? America, you're about to fall off a financial cliff and drag the rest of the world with you. Let's try Barack Obama, 44-year-old, upstart who's in the Senate for 10 minutes. So we've seen this pattern before. We know, though, that Adams will be judged on crime. The difference between sort of Adams and Dinkins is that Adams has this NYPD background, and he's literally, again, got some issues, has decided, let's just give the NYPD all the things.
Yeah.
All the things. No libraries for kids, right? And so he campaigned, though, Doug, on this, Desmond Tutu philosophy of stop pulling. I'm going to butcher this quote, but, follow along. You guys followed the primary, right? But it's like, stop pulling people who are drowning out of the water. Let's go upstream to the top of the waterfall and see why people are falling into the water. And let's capture them there before they come down the stream and then they start drowning in the water. That, to me, made sense. That's actually what Brandon Johnson essentially said, the new mayor-elect of Chicago, right? Except for fast forward to Mayor Adams getting elected, and we now see we're just going to put more police in the water to pull out these drowning people, as opposed to all the social services that Eric Adams said were needed to make sure people don't fall into the stream. So it's not surprising to me that Eric Adams has decided to give NYPD back pay. He doesn't want them to turn his back on him the way they did to de Blasio, who had a famously antagonistic relationship with the NYPD. He is from them. Many sort of detractors of Eric Adams say that he is a blue mayor, not a Black mayor, right? That he will always think like a cop, act like a cop, and be a mayor second, right? His first few weeks of being a mayor, he always had his NYPD jacket on as opposed to a mayor's jacket on. So there's a real sort of ethos of when you are in a paramilitary organization for many decades, how that transition is a little difficult for a lot of people to make from police to elected officials, specifically mayor. So where are we with policing? Obviously, he's supported his police department, especially with the scandal with the police officer who sort of flashed a gun at 3 young people, and that kind of precinct drama, and sort of the blue wall, the blue curtain, whatever you want to call it. So where are we with Eric Adams and the NYPD, and should that be a concern?
Being an out of borough white ethnic, I understand why whites, Blacks, Hispanics, and Asians are afraid of crime, and both the reality of crime and the perception of crime. And the police are a means by which crime can be controlled to a certain extent. And it's the immediacy of the impact of the police that I think makes it appealing to both the mayor and large swaths of the electorate, I feel. So from a strategic and tactical point of view, I think in the short term, it is an effective strategy. More police, wise police. I hate to bring up stop and frisk and broken windows, but I mean, you don't want to go back to unconstitutional behaviors. But I think among the general public, there is a feeling that we need more public safety, and public safety in the mind of not everybody, many people are the police, and dealing with root causes, stopping the people at the top of the waterfall. You have to do some of that, but the immediate perceived and real crisis is there.
No, I always think about sort of the difference though between crime and the perception of crime, because oftentimes the people who are most afraid of crime have no interaction with crime whatsoever.
Right.
So, it's like the city's so dangerous. It's like, settle down. Nothing's happening in your neighborhood. It's just like, your fears of the other and what's going on in other places. And so I feel like Adams, though, is tapped into that because he knows that he will or will not get reelected based on a perception of crime and not necessarily the numbers and the data.
Yeah, I mean, there is a divergence between the reality and the perception, but the perception is real. The reality is shifting, and it is not only the people who are not experiencing it who perceive it, it's people in Black and brown communities, the Asian community, who fear it and are also, in a sense, experiencing it.
Right.
So, I mean, it's a citywide, multi-racial, multi-ethnic view. If you look at the polling data, it's there. People of all races and ethnicities are becoming or have become increasingly wary of crime.
Right. Well, I mean, we know that that's obviously going to come back up in 2025. I mean, I remember watching, I believe it was the second Democratic debate, when Maya Wiley was asked explicitly whether or not she would increase police officers on the subway. And she said no. And I was like, well, there goes her election. I mean, it was over, because I think a lot of people, the same people in her sort of progressive base who were just like defund the police or we need fewer policing, are also people who want to see police officers on the subway, whether they want to say that out loud or not.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's exactly it. I mean, I ride the subway. I don't find the subway particularly dangerous, but there are events in the subway that make people afraid.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I mean, and sadly, the surveys that I've seen from Riders Alliance and other transportation advocacy organizations, when they've surveyed women about negative sexual harassment interactions on the subway, the data comes back at 99% of women have had a negative interaction on the subway. So we also have to be conscious of sort of some gender dynamics that still exist.
Yes. And my wife has regaled me with many stories of, inappropriate male behavior on the subways.
Right. On this. I was like, if you left it at inappropriate male behavior, it's like, okay, well, welcome to New York City politics. Okay, so here we are. We've got some other issues. What do you think? And I saw John put in a question about COVID. So I'm still very clear that we are in the midst of a global pandemic. I know that Americans are exhausted. I know New Yorkers are exhausted. I still wear a mask and look like an alien compared to everyone else. I still have students who get COVID on a regular basis. And it's like, oh, it's, I'm living with COVID. It's like, no, but I still also know a lot of people who have long-term COVID, which will obviously put a financial strain on our public health and hospital systems for years and decades to come. So that is an issue that I think the mayor should have as a priority. What would you say should be the mayor's top 3 priorities? And what do you think are the mayor's top 3 priorities? Yes, Doug, I need you to solve all the problems of New York this morning.
I mean, writ large, education,
Okay.
crime, and housing.
Okay.
I mean, those are three main issues that virtually either directly or indirectly affect all New Yorkers.
What do you think the mayor's three priorities are?
I don't know. I don't. Crime, and crime. I think he's heavily focused on that. I mean, obviously, given an administration as large as the city administration, and given the fact that the city does so many things, he's got multiple priorities.
Mm-hmm.
And I would think that the big three are the big three.
Right. You know, when I think about education, I think about the difference between, say, Adams and de Blasio, where, you know, when de Blasio was trying to combine public schools on the Upper West Side, and, you know, the parents were complaining like it was Mississippi in 1962. And it's just like, your kids in kindergarten. I mean, like, they're sharing glue sticks and paint. Like, I don't understand how you're equating your kids going to school with, you know, kids from the projects as like the worst sort of issue ever. But it happened, and we saw that de Blasio got a lot of pushback. It seems as though Adams is taking a different strategy, though, when it comes to education, which is, you know, we can keep our selective high schools. We'll just make more selective high schools, right? And we'll just make the high schools better. It's like, you know, you don't want your kids to be integrated with Black and Latino kids because you sort of view that as like all of a sudden a decrease in education sort of prowess. So sure, we'll just like elevate these poor public schools, and we won't bother you good white liberals who have voted for Obama twice and would vote for him a third time if you could, because we'll just sort of work over here with education and not really bother you, and sort of force this integration that de Blasio talked about.
Yeah, but it's more than simply a white versus Black phenomenon. I think the Asian community is particularly susceptible to a race analysis of a lot of what's going on. Mm-hmm. Jails in Chinatown, the elite high school entrance exams, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this cuts across groups, and Asians are a group who I feel they're not all with Adams. I mean, he got 60% of the Asian vote, but significant percentage, more than a third of Asians voted against him, and Asian precincts voted against him in total. So I think there's more than a Black-white phenomenon. I mean, in fact, what you have in New York City that undergirds the entire time period is you have increased diversity of racial and ethnic groups, and you have a dispersion of these ethnic and racial groups, a deconcentration from the original landing places, and you have them leaking out across the city, which makes the dynamic of politics much more interesting because there aren't as many pure racial or ethnic groups, and that demands a coalitional politics rather than a more traditional, if I may, confrontational politics.
Right, but would it bode well for Adams, as we've seen Asian Americans in New York keep trending to be more and more conservative? That seems like that would help Adams in a lot of ways with a lot of his policies, right? And I mean, I think that, you know, sadly, the debate has been framed as kind of like Black and Latino students versus white and Asian students, but Adams doesn't seem as though he's trying to kick the hornet's nest of, let's just say, integration of the select public high schools, right? We know that that's obviously, education is
Right.
always the third rail. Integration of education we literally have a Supreme Court case that talks about it. We know that
Right.
cities and states across the country went out of the way to make sure that that was like a slow walk, right? And so we know, though, that, like, you know, when you think about Stuyvesant, my friends from my generation, Stuyvesant was 40% Black, Brooklyn Tech, 40% Black, Bronx Science, 40% Black. We can't say that all of a sudden there are no Black smart students in New York City. Something's going on, right? But it doesn't seem as though Adams is saying we need to figure out sort of this hyper testing and all this other stuff to change the system. I thought his solution was, we'll just create more specialized high schools so as not to antagonize the white Asian base over here and to sort of give something to the Black Latino base over there.
You have to see what the educational outputs are and what they're intended to be to see if it's working. I don't see any data that reflects any particular direction in the education debate.
Right. All right. So there's education. You said housing was another. And we still are just, what do you think about Adams' plan to sort of convert downtown sort of vacant businesses?
Well, I mean, I think it's a good idea. Is it technically feasible? Is it economically feasible? You know, this seems to be the grand panacea. You know, Midtown's emptying out, the city's emptying out. You're having a massive outflow of population during the pandemic. Whether they'll come back is problematic. So these open spaces are theoretically available, but I hope somebody in the housing community will address this. I think the technical problems in converting it could be prohibitive, if not enormous. And if enormous in terms of funds, it ain't going to happen.
Mm-hmm. I think, you know, I see some really good questions in the chat. Do we want to sort of open it? I like to leave more time for Q&A just because I think that's when we get sort of real robust discussion. But I see Jack has put in the chat, why has New York been searching for 50 years for a mayor with governing capacity and a real city constituency? What do you mean by that, Jack? Oh, can we unmute Jack? Is that possible?
Had a mayor who has both.
Hold on, Jack, start from the beginning because you were on mute for quite some time.
You're still on mute.
Can someone unmute Jack? There we go.
All
right, start from the beginning, Jack. Welcome.
Yeah, I'm looking at this conversation, which has some of the most broad perspective people in the city as far as how to lead it. And I think we're frustrated, all of us, that we haven't had the right people want to be mayor, make the effort to be mayor and have the capacity to be mayor for 50 years. And maybe you could make an argument Koch had that dual capability. He both had a strong city constituency and he could govern them, although he did it in some kind of unique way. Some people might argue for Bloomberg, but I don't know where the city constituency is there. And with Dinkins, it's a bit of a question whether he had the capacity to really manage the city. So I think that's the basic problem, why either people who now have that dual capacity don't come forward to do it because they don't want the job, or nobody's been able to grow into the job. And I think maybe there's a ray of hope about Eric Adams. He has the constituency. I think there's no question about that. But does he have the capacity to find the people and manage them and the interest in managing them that it's going to take to make it?
I mean, you're right, Jack. I mean, the second part of your statement is absolutely true. Does he have the capacity to lead in the way that you suggest that New York City deserves?
Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, to Jack's point, some of that is also, you know, Doug, you mentioned this, it's hiring and staffing. You know, I felt like de Blasio hired really smart people and then didn't listen to them.
Right.
I feel like Adams has hired some questionable characters, to say the least, and is listening to them. So I'm like, this is like the worst of both worlds. What is happening? And not saying that everyone in Adams' world is, you know, incompetent, but I definitely felt like the talent pool for de Blasio was maybe this is my 20 years on the Upper West Side bias showing, and I live in one of those 5 neighborhoods that Adams didn't bother going to, you know, I just felt like the talent pool from the de Blasio end made sense to me. The talent pool from the Adams end has me scratching my head oftentimes.
And the talent pool for Bloomberg was on many levels better than the talent pool drawn from by both de Blasio and Adams.
Okay, so Doug, let's talk about that because I don't want to spend too, well, you know, it's New York, we can talk about everybody, but like, let's flesh out the Bloomberg era because granted, I was, you know, and John Mollenkoff knows this. I mean, during much of the Bloomberg era, I was trapped in graduate school. So I was basically in a hostage situation. So I'm like paying attention, but like my brain was, you know, I was doing my best. But I felt like Bloomberg, in his quest for efficiency, fundamentally did not understand race and class in a way that made me feel comfortable, right? And so there were a lot of times when I heard the mayor speak, and I was much younger, and this is when I was making $15,000 a year, and my rent was $750 in Columbia housing. So like my financial stability was precarious at best. And so I just felt like there were so many times that poor New Yorkers said, hey, like what you're proposing doesn't make sense to me or doesn't help me. And he was like, okay, well then figure it out. I just felt like there was a callousness when it came to class that Bloomberg had, where he was forgiven in many ways because it's like, well, it's for the sake of efficiency and like the businesses won't leave. Walk me through your analysis.
Well, I mean, you're obviously partly correct that he had that orientation. He had a businessman's orientation. He tended to focus on efficiency, but that wasn't the entire thrust of his administration. And he was very pro-immigration. I don't know. I think that he was tone deaf and it was based on class, but was it an extreme negative in terms of his policy outputs? I don't know. I'm not sure.
Okay. Let's see. Bloomberg's motto for New York City was the world's second home. Yeah, and you remember, you know, he made the plazas and very, you know, welcoming to tourists. I just felt like sometimes it wasn't welcoming to, you know, sort of New Yorkers that were struggling. And I mean, listen, you know, I didn't have a pony in the race for many of the issues, right? I didn't have kids in public school. I was in Columbia housing. I wasn't on the open market. So there are a lot of things that, you know, Bloomberg did where I'm hearing from folks who were interacting with the mayor's policies in ways that I wasn't. Hilary, how about I bring you in? I know you've been collecting questions, and I'm sure our audience members have lots of questions for Doug. I just also want to thank you all for being such great audience participants so early in the morning, since we're still in the debate as to whether this is early or late. My sister's an MD, and so her meetings start at like 6:30, and she's just like, you all start at 9, like the day is done. So I want to appreciate the fact that we all, you know, what is time, right?
It's early.
It's COVID. What is time? Time is merely a construct. So
Exactly. Yes, and I think also we had a little, I think we've sent out slightly inconsistent messages about the end time. Some said 10 and some said 10:30. So we're going to split the difference and end at 10:15, just for those of you in the audience. But yes, lots of great questions. There are a bunch of questions focused on crime in the NYPD and housing, and I think we've talked about that a fair amount. So I'm going to sort of hold those. But John Mollenkoff, who's been mentioned a lot, had a question about recovery post-COVID. What should the mayor and the rest of us be doing about recovery in the post-COVID era? We see lots of lingering damage. For example, the lost years of education for older school children, actually younger ones as well, or the coming fiscal crunch for CUNY, which many of us are experiencing firsthand. So I think that's sort of a forward-thinking question that might be nice for the two of you to think about.
I think one core is from the Adams administration that they have a strong intergovernmental operation, and that our concerns, particularly from CUNY, are met at the state level. It's partly a funding level question, and it's also a political control question. Under Andrew Cuomo, it was more political control than anything else, and we need to have a partnership with the state where the state fully funds the system, because CUNY is the bedrock of the upper, the upper working class movement into the middle class. So I would say relationship with the state and what the state can do.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Doug's point about the CUNY system as an entree into the middle class can't be underscored enough. Next year when I'm on sabbatical, as I mentioned, I'll be a Moynihan Fellow at City College. And, in talking to the leaders of City College, they said the current president of Yale, his father went to CUNY, right? The incoming president of Harvard, Claudine Gay, who's a political scientist, a Haitian immigrant, both of her parents went to CUNY. And so we see city colleges, in specifically the CUNY system, as an entree, not just into the collegiate world, but into the middle class, into sort of people staying in New York and like building a life. And so the importance of funding the CUNY system and sort of supporting the CUNYs, and that's all CUNYs, not just, the grad center and City College and, sort of the jewels that people feel like supporting. It has to be a robust understanding. I think this goes back to the Chrissy Doug conversation about sort of the funding of the NYPD and the quiet defunding of, I've been on this, anyone who listens to FAQ on this call knows that I've been ringing this alarm about the NYPL, the New York Public Library, for over a month now. I am positively livid because we also know that there is a direct line between the New York Public Library and the CUNY system. Kids who go there to use the computers or read books or even sit in air conditioning so that, they're like not on the street. The public library system serves as a pipeline into so many positives that the CUNY system supports.
I'm not sure that I agree with both of you, but I'm not sure. Those were great contexts. Did you answer the question of what we should be doing though?
Okay, can you repeat the question then?
I think those are great points about the importance of CUNY. What should the mayor and the rest of us be doing about recovery in the post-COVID era? We see lots of
what does recovery mean?
Economic recovery, I'm assuming, but also John references educational recovery for, kids who basically lost 2 years of schooling.
Here's the thing. Part of the reason why I don't think that we'll fully recover is because we're not fully acknowledging that it's still happening. So, a lot of people, they're over it. And it's like, well, it's real. When I talk to people who have long-term COVID, of which, these are like healthy 30, 40 something year olds who are running marathons and now, are literally seeing, 15 different doctors from dermatologists to cardiologists. We're not sort of acknowledging some of the silent struggles that people have. There's also still the stigma of people who have long-term COVID. And so obviously universities and schools and jobs want everyone to get back to normal. So, at the end of the day, it's money, right? So we can make money, right? So colleges are like, we can't justify a $65,000 price tag if we're on Zoom, and not everybody is great on Zoom, period. I'll leave it at that. We know that a lot of students have basically had a 1.5 year gap in their educational pursuits. So a lot of work of professors is really, I'm just sort of trying to figure out where people are, because not everyone's at the same type of high school where you had great Zoom or not. Or if you were in college, did you have good professors on Zoom or not? And some people, I'm really interested in learning styles. Some people, it's very hard to be talked at on a computer. They need human contact. We're mammals, for Pete's sake. Remind Republicans of that. So I do think that there is a lack of acknowledgement as to the struggles that people have gone through. And we oftentimes talk about also the financial struggles. Like, there are a lot of people who are of strong mind, but have been severely affected by lockdown, or have been severely affected by COVID, sort of the feelings of isolation. And we're not even talking about the 1 million deaths. Like, it is important that we acknowledge 9/11. We talk about it, we honor it as New Yorkers. That's a little over 2,000 people. We have had this massive scale of death that we're not talking about. So I don't understand how we can move forward and heal and sort of figure out how a city functions in the educational space and all these other policy arenas if we're not even acknowledging like this massive trauma that we have experienced collectively, but also individually at the same time.
To answer John's question, in terms of CUNY, I would put much more money in the community colleges because the high school losses of learning were profound. And I think that if we have increased funding for CUNY, a larger proportion should go to the community colleges because they prepare the students and provide the remediation that would be necessary to be prepared to attend the senior colleges.
Great, thank you. Thank you for letting me push you a little more. Actually, then going back, a question from Marco DeSena. There have been a handful of electeds in the last couple of elections who are not from here, largely middle to upper class white men and women living in highly gentrified neighborhoods where minorities were for many decades the majority. I'm looking at you, Brooklyn. Do you think this has had an effect on the pipeline of Black and brown elected officials, or will have an effect?
I think it will. I mean, especially for Black politics, which is what I study. You know, I mean, obviously the New York Times has done lots of stories about, you know, sort of Black people leaving the city. And it's, you know, some of it's voluntary. Much of it is, you know, because see previous conversation about housing stock, you know, sort of predatory lenders and exploitative practices where people in Brooklyn are losing their houses. We know that the city has been, you know, foreclosing on Black houses so much they had to like pause it because it was like, we're getting so much real estate, like we don't even know what to do with all this land. Like we're just taking it, you know, so easily and so quickly. So I do think that the fact that so many Black New Yorkers are being pushed out will obviously have an effect on leadership. I mean, also, you know, if you don't have a strong public university system or public community college system, that also affects leadership. And then, you know, we alluded to this in the very beginning when Doug kind of laid out, you know, our Harlem foundation, and I love Charlie Rangel. Don't get me wrong. I absolutely love the Lion of the House. However, so many people were in a holding pattern for decades, waiting for the baton to be passed. Ask Keith Wright. Ask half of Harlem, who thought that they would have the careers that they never had. Because after 23 successful elections and 46 years in Congress, Charlie Rangel then decides to retire. So I do think, you know, when we look at the leadership of the Democratic Party, just on the national level, I love you, Nancy Pelosi. Okay, Maxine Waters, Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden. We're in like septuagenarian, octogenarian territory to say, and I'm not trying to be ageist at all. I hope and pray one day I can be in my 70s and 80s. But you know, you look at someone like Barbara Feinstein.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, like, but you look at someone like Barbara Feinstein, and it's like, how dare you do this to the citizens of California? Right? You're 89 years old. Go spend time with your grandkids. Why do you even want to be in this office this long? Right. And so I do think that it's, you know, not just a Republican problem, but the Democrats on local, state, and national levels have a problem with giving up power. And I think that's just a human condition. But what are we doing to sow the seeds for future generations? And I think, you know, the mayor's race showed us, you know, like age appropriate leadership, sure. But we have to really think about if, you know, our pipeline is going to Albany and then doing all these other jobs, we really need to do a much better job. You know, as a professor, I'm trying to sort of plant these seeds in my students' heads early, which is, you know, run for office, you know, and it doesn't have to be governor, right? You can run for, you know, just be on the community board to see if you even like this and then sort of transition. I mean, we know being a state senator, state legislator is an incredibly important job. You're in charge of over $200 billion and lots of policy issues that directly affect our lives on a daily basis. Being a city council member, again, like serious grassroots problem solving that's incredibly important. But for, now that we have the new system where we're term limited in city council, but not in Albany, what we're doing is just seeing like sometimes the swapping of the lemons. So it's just like, well, I'll do my 8 years. And then Doug, you come down from Albany, I'll just get your seat, you get my seat, and then we'll just kind of keep it in the family. And we can't have a political system that works.
Charles Barron and his wife switch seats on a regular basis.
Because if you ask Charles Barron says there should always be a Barron in the city council and in Albany. Because as I'm on the editorial board of the Amsterdam News, and we asked him that very question. It seems as though you just swap out your seat and you put your wife in, and then your wife swaps out her seats and she puts you in. And do you see that as a problem? And he said, absolutely not. Because there should always be a Barron in city council and there should always be a Barron in Albany. And if we have that mindset, because we're seeing it in Harlem now too, with certain city council members sort of making these horse trading deals with various members in Albany, what does that mean for young people, and how it makes my job much harder to get young people into politics and excited about politics if it's one, riddled with money, and two, it's like, well, I mean, how am I going to fight literally a family machine that will not leave any space for new ideas?
One thing that we haven't discussed, except peripherally, is the impact of term limits on the politics of the city. I'm personally against term limits. I think they should be, elections should be term limits, but there is an argument for term limits at both the executive level and at the legislative level, may be different. Have the legislature have more terms than the executive, and Albany is a mess. And Albany, as much as I hate term limits, it says to me, we need some kind of limits on incumbency.
Right. Well, I mean, Albany is, we had that stretch in time where it's just like, however many people in Albany were all in prison playing, poker with Ja Rule. I mean, there was an Albany to prison pipeline that was highly problematic because no one was watching the store. And to John's point, yes, we are very excited. And Morgan said this in the welcoming, because of some of the efforts of the Samuels family and Samuels Center, we do see a new cohort of city council members, which is phenomenal. And we've seen a new cohort of, sort of some state senators and state legislators, but it's like, we still have a long way to go. And we also need to make sure that we support them in a capacity where they don't then just turn, they don't sort of learn by bad example, being surrounded by people where it's like, oh, so I'm entitled to this seat for 8 years, and then I'll just go and, be in Albany for however long because I'm just a professional politician now. And we lose the key phrase, we call them politicians, but they're public servants. And so really making sure that we sort of elect public servants, but continue to support and remind them that they serve at the pleasure of their constituencies, and their elected seats aren't just guaranteed or given to them on a sort of assumed basis.
Here's a question that actually might be a good question it's not anyhow. It might be the last question we'll see from Morgan. Do you think a problem all New York City mayors face is that they overpromise what they can accomplish, when the truth is that they are highly dependent on the federal and state governments to actually get anything done? I was thinking about this when you were talking about housing. I mean, it's
when you campaign, you have to overpromise. I mean, as Mario Cuomo said, you campaign in poetry, but you're doomed to govern in prose. So, I mean, if you want to win, you have to overpromise.
Morgan, many years ago, this is during the 2016 race in Harlem, and I lived in Harlem at the time. And, it's an open seat because Rangel has decided to retire. And so I had an event where I invited the congressional candidates to come and essentially present their case to a room full of Black women who lived in Harlem. And the issues that they brought up, albeit fascinating, you're not in charge of any of these issues. So also, most people don't know the difference between local, state, and federal responsibilities. And so when they were campaigning, they're promising all these things. I was like, well, that's not what your job does. Like, this issue that you're talking about, I was like, that's a city council member, or this issue
Right.
you're talking about, it's like,
Right.
that's a president, or, that's a mayor's job. That's not a member of Congress. So this idea that, I think a lot of people campaign in these promises of jobs that they're not running for. And then also to the question of, there's so many budgets. I mean, the mayor's budget, so much of it is spoken for. This is why I think the strategic tin can conversations are always so interesting when a mayor goes to Albany to essentially negotiate with state legislators and state senators and the governor. And this is why I never understood de Blasio's antagonistic relationship with the governor and the members in Albany, because so much of our money sort of, funnels through other channels, even in the federal government as well. And so, most of my students and most New Yorkers, don't know that, the MTA isn't controlled by the mayor, right? However many times I would sit on the, a stalled subway and everyone's like, thanks a lot, de Blasio. And I was like, he's got literally very little to do with this stalled train in any capacity, but they don't, these are also people who haven't voted for their state senator or state legislator and maybe not even governor. And I'm not blaming New Yorkers, because we also ask New Yorkers to vote constantly. Like literally almost every year, we're asking them to come to the polls 3 or 4 times a year, depending on where you live. So, I don't think it's voter apathy for everyone. I think for some people it's voter fatigue, and they don't know what they're voting for because we're constantly asking them to come and vote. So I think that's, one of the Achilles heels of also having our municipal elections on odd number years. People tend to call those off years and assume that they can take off.
I think that one thing that the immediately prior discussion has led to is what we need is programs that teach prospective candidates to run for office, and also what office they're running for, and to indicate to them what your responsibilities are. Now at Baruch in both 2001 and 2005, we held massive events covering several days for legislators, both city council members and assembly people and say state senators, that taught them exactly what to do, what the issues were, what the procedures were. And I haven't seen anything like that either at Baruch or anywhere else in the city. Now, the League of Women Voters used to do that and may do it in the future, but there's no campaign school and that could teach candidates both the techniques of the campaign and the rigors of the campaign and the powers and duties of the office of which they're seeking.
I think we have a good retirement project for Doug. Yeah, absolutely. This has been amazing. I'm going to turn it over to Sherry to kind of close us out, but thank you so much, everyone.
Great. Thank you so much, Doug and Christina. This has been absolutely fascinating. I'm a newcomer to New York, so I very much appreciate hearing your perspectives. Super interesting, branching off into housing and so many other issues along this history of mayors in the city. So very much appreciate this. Appreciate all of the many attendees this morning, and look forward to seeing you again on some other Marxe event Zoom calls, or maybe even in person soon. Maybe we'll get together and brainstorm about some follow-up ideas that we've heard here, and look forward to being in touch with you. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you for
Thank
having
you.
us.